I used to believe that betrayal was something that happened in movies or dramatic Reddit stories, not real life. My name's Natalie, I'm 28, and I thought I had it all figured out. A steady job at a marketing agency, a cozy apartment downtown, and a small but loyal circle of friends. My best friend, Claire, had been in my life since college. We were inseparable. From late-night study sessions to spontaneous road trips. She was the kind of friend who finished my sentences and knew every embarrassing story about me. My boyfriend, Ethan, was the other constant in my life. We'd been dating for 3 years. He was charming, patient, and the kind of guy who sent good morning texts and never forgot anniversaries. I thought I'd found my person. Looking back, I now realize how perfectly my life looked on the outside, and how blind I was to the cracks forming beneath it. It started small. Claire began spending more time around Ethan. She dropped by unannounced, claiming she just happened to be nearby. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, she was my best friend, and Ethan was friendly with everyone. But soon I noticed things, little gestures that made my gut tighten. The way she laughed a bit too loudly at his jokes. The way his eyes lingered on her when he thought I wasn't looking. One night, I came home from work earlier than usual. Ethan had said he'd be working late, so I was surprised to see his car parked outside. I brushed it off. Maybe he'd forgotten something. But when I opened the door, I heard laughter from the bedroom. My stomach dropped. I remember my hands shaking as I pushed the door open. There they were, Claire and Ethan, tangled in the sheets that I had bought, the ones we used together. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. They froze, faces pale, mouths opening to form excuses I never wanted to hear. I didn't scream or cry. I just turned and walked out. The world outside felt unreal. The sounds of the city blurred into white noise as I sat in my car, trying to process that my two favorite people had destroyed everything I trusted. They tried calling me for days. Claire left messages saying she was so sorry and that it just happened. Ethan begged me to talk, but I couldn't. I packed his things, left them outside my apartment, and blocked them both from my life. For weeks, I went through the motions. Work, sleep, repeat, but inside I was numb. The betrayal had carved something deep inside me that I didn't recognize. And yet, as the numbness faded, something colder took its place. Resolve. Claire and Ethan didn't last long together. I heard through mutual friends that they moved in together a month later, and that he'd lost his job around the same time. Karma, I thought, but karma wasn't enough for me. I wanted something more deliberate. Something that would make her understand what it felt like to lose everything she thought was secure. That's when the idea began forming in my mind. Not out of spite, but out of a deep, quiet hunger for justice. Claire had always been ambitious but careless. She'd recently started a small event planning company with her ex, Adam, a guy she'd dated briefly before Ethan. They'd managed to get a few big clients, but I knew how unstable their finances were. She often bragged about how much potential they had. Yet I knew from experience that potential means nothing without structure. Through a mutual friend, I learned that they were looking for investors to expand their business. That's when opportunity knocked. I had savings, and I had connections through my job. So I played a role. The successful marketing professional looking to invest in promising small businesses. Using a different name, I reached out to them through a contact, pretending to represent a group of potential investors. My pitch was simple. We'd provide funding in exchange for partial ownership and marketing collaboration. Claire didn't recognize me right away when we met in person. I'd changed my hair, my style, and even my last name on the documents. She looked at me with polite curiosity, but didn't connect the dots. Maybe she didn't want to. I'll never forget that first meeting, sitting across from her, smiling, while she excitedly pitched her business. I nodded, asked questions, and watched her talk about her vision for the future. Inside, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pain. This was the same woman who'd looked me in the eyes and betrayed me. Now she was unknowingly trying to impress me. I signed the initial agreement, offering a small investment to help her with a new event project. She and Adam were ecstatic, promising that it would be the beginning of something huge. I smiled, shook her hand, and told her I believed in her dream. She had no idea that dream was about to collapse, piece by piece, by the very person she had betrayed. In the following weeks, I watched everything unfold perfectly. I attended their meetings, helped them draft proposals, and introduced them to my colleagues, who were actually friends from my company helping me pull off the illusion. They believed every word, but I wasn't just sabotaging them financially. I was collecting information, details about their contracts, and paid bills, client disputes, and even personal disagreements. They were so eager to grow that they didn't notice how carelessly they shared confidential data. I didn't have to do much. I just waited for them to dig their own graves. And they did. Their biggest event, a high-profile wedding, was coming up, one that could make or break their business. I made sure it broke them. By the time the wedding week arrived, I had everything set up. A single miscommunication, a few misplaced emails, and one conveniently timed mistake were all it took to bring their operation to chaos. The vendors pulled out, the venue canceled, and the couple sued the company for breach of contract. I watched it all unfold quietly, keeping my identity hidden as long as possible. But as satisfying as it was to see the cracks widen, I couldn't shake a strange guilt, like part of me was still that heartbroken girl, seeking peace instead of vengeance. Still, the game had begun, and I wasn't ready to stop yet. I watched the fallout like someone watching glass shatter in slow motion, each tiny fragment catching the light differently. The wedding that was supposed to validate Claire and Adam's business dissolved into a mess of angry vendors, frantic calls, and irate clients demanding refunds. What began as a carefully planted error in an email chain, a swapped vendor deposit reference that made it look as if payments had been sent and then mysteriously reversed, rippled outward, until every subcontractor involved pulled their services. The venue manager claimed a double booking. The florist accused Claire of changing terms last minute. The photographer threatened legal action. Within 72 hours, their reputation went from promising to toxic. I did not gloat loudly. I sat in a corner of my favorite coffee shop and breathed as if I had just run a marathon. Part of me ached with a grief I could not name. Another part felt the steady, cold satisfaction of someone who had finally seen the scales tip. When the dust settled, Claire called me. Or rather, she tried to. She left a message on a burner number I'd set up, pleading for help without knowing she was talking to me. She described the panic. Clients threatening to expose them on social media, creditors calling, eviction notices arriving for their shared studio. The words she used were the same she had used when she'd promised she would always be there for me. For a moment, I nearly answered, told her everything, let the floodgates open and risk the fragile structure I'd built. I did not. Instead, I listened in the silence of my parked car, hearing nothing but her desperation through the cheap speakerphone, and then hung up without a sound. It was an act I later told myself was necessary, a transaction of pain for pain. They tried to rebuild. Adam, who handled logistics, patched together what little goodwill remained and took out a loan under his name. Claire scrabbled for freelance gigs, working late nights to cover rent and feed the dog she refused to give up. They fought in the small hours over money, over blame, and over the humiliation of seeing their online presence shredded by angry comments and one savage thread on a popular forum dissecting every fail. Through this storm, a rumor began to spread that their business had been sabotaged internally. Fingers pointed, old secrets resurfaced, and the fragile trust between Claire and Adam frayed. She started to suspect someone was orchestrating their downfall on purpose. I read the messages she posted, the late-night journal entries she accidentally uploaded to a shared cloud folder, and I felt a strange pang of remorse when she wrote, in a moment of raw honesty, that she didn't know who she was without success. That sentence lodged in me like a splinter. I had wanted to wound her, but I hadn't planned to watch her identity crumble. As their finances dwindled, the cracks extended into her social life. Mutual friends distanced themselves, awkwardly citing bad timing or busy schedules. Invitations dried up. The woman who once orchestrated birthday surprises and bridal showers now found herself eating microwave meals alone in a couch she couldn't afford to replace. I watched from a distance as Claire's charm, the very thing that had made her magnetic, turned inward and became brittle. She started trusting people less, asking more questions, scanning emails for clues of treachery. The irony was sharp. She became the kind of person she had been when she accused others of betrayal, never once considering that betrayal could come from the least expected place. Meanwhile, Ethan drifted back into my orbit like a storm cloud you can't fully predict. He'd lost his job, indeed, and his time with Claire had unraveled into regret and petty fights. I heard through the grapevine that he'd tried to reconnect with Claire after the wedding debacle, saying things like we were reckless and I made a mistake. But Claire, brutal and proud, pushed him away. He emailed me once, under his own name, asking for forgiveness, asking to meet, to talk like adults. I read his message and felt the old familiar hurt spike anew. Not the kind that wanted revenge, but the kind that wanted to be seen. For one drunken night, I considered letting him in just to watch the confusion on Claire's face. For one heartbeat, I almost told him who I was. I did not. I deleted his message instead and felt strangely liberated by the person I had become. Someone who could choose to let go. Even as they flailed, I kept feeding small doses of misfortune into their lives. It wasn't large-scale cruelty. It was strategic erosion. A crucial invoice went missing and reappeared with the wrong bank details. A contract clause was left and signed because an email chain was apparently never forwarded. A client who had loved their aesthetic pulled out after reading a terse, anonymous review that hinted at poor communication and missed deadlines. Each act was surgical, and I justified them in the name of balance. But with each success, the mirror showed me a face I did not always recognize, tighter, more cautious, sometimes hollowed by the cost of holding a grudge. There were nights I woke up convinced I'd crossed an invisible moral line. I told myself that Claire's betrayal had moved that line. She had redrawn the border of what was acceptable when she chose her own gratification over our friendship. Then came the day the landlord served an eviction notice for their studio. Adam, who had always been pragmatic, tried to negotiate a payment plan. But their bank accounts were frozen by a lien placed by a vendor demanding payment. They began to minus one off equipment piece by piece. Clients who once queued to book them now avoided the brand like a contagion. On social media, friends who had once praised Claire's flair posted polite condolences about pivotal moments and new dire actions, while secretly untagging photos and dissolving connections. I watched a woman I had loved and trusted reduce herself to a shell of hustle and humiliation, and I felt both triumphant and sick. Triumph for the collapse I'd engineered, sickness for the loneliness that was becoming my companion. The twist came when Claire started to fight back in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. She hired a lawyer using the last of her savings, not to sue me. She didn't know I was involved, but to go after a so-called consultant who'd advised them incorrectly during the wedding negotiation. She combed through emails, contracts, and bank statements, and then, with the obsessive focus that used to characterize our study sessions in college, she began to uncover anomalies. A pattern emerged. Someone had been manipulating communication, redirecting payments, and interfering with vendor relations. Her indignation sharpened into something dangerous. She set up trackers, checked IP logs, and interviewed staff. Slowly, painfully, she began to suspect that the sabotage wasn't internal after all. Someone external was orchestrating it. One night, Claire posted a long, bitter thread about betrayal and consequences that went viral within a niche community. People sympathized, shared their own ruined stories, and tagged accounts they thought might help. This exposure reignited interest in their work, but it came tethered to a new reality: the legal scrutiny that followed. An investigative blogger reached out wanting to dig deeper. Friends urged Claire to release the receipts, to name names. In public she was defiant, privately she was unraveling. The more she fought, the more enemies she made, but also the more she seemed to find a backbone I hadn't seen in months. Watching her rebuild, inch by stubborn inch, complicated everything for me. She was learning from the fall, carving herself out of the wreckage. If my goal had been to make her understand loss, then perhaps it was working. But if it was to keep her trapped in ruin, she was proving annoyingly resilient. I realized then that revenge had consequences I hadn't fully foreseen. It didn't simply break someone and leave them broken. It forced them to either melt away or reconstruct themselves into something new. Claire's rebuilding threatened to undo my whole plan by turning her into a version I could no longer punish, a survivor who learned and adapted. That thought spurred me to escalate, but not with blind cruelty. If she was going to fight back, I needed leverage that could not be easily repaired. I began to look for legal pressure points, relationships that could topple under scrutiny, and financial obligations she believed were settled. I wanted the kind of finality that leaves no room for recovery. Yet as I mapped this new assault, I kept catching my reflection in windows and cafe mirrors, a woman who had become as calculating as people she despised. It made me wonder if, in trying to reclaim what was taken, I'd become someone else entirely. I started digging for pressure points that weren't easily patched. Not because I wanted to hurt Adam more than Claire, but because Adam's pragmatism made him the weak hinge upon which their fragile world swung. If I could pry that hinge loose, everything would tumble irreparably. I hired an investigator through a friend who owed me a favor and asked for a simple, non-specific audit of their business health. Nothing illegal, just a professional scan for liabilities. The results were a mess. Unpaid tax filings from a quarter they'd misreported, a series of vendor agreements signed without clear authorization, and a personal loan Adam had taken against the company equipment. The report read like a slow-motion train wreck. My stomach flipped when I realized how easily their livelihood could be framed as insolvency rather than mismanagement. It felt like holding a match to paper that had already been dampened with rot. I rationalized every step with the same brittle logic I'd used before. She'd betrayed me. She chose a reckless night over a years-long friendship. She deserved to feel the precariousness she'd caused. But rationalization is an insulation against the cold that settles in afterward. I used the audit as leverage, not to blackmail, but to bend outcomes in their direction of ruin. I passed anonymous tips to a regulatory hotline, making sure they were non-specific but damning enough to trigger an inquiry. I fed a journalist a hint about a local small business scandal without revealing names, watching as curiosity took hold and began to peel back layers of their operations. Social platforms amplified every rumor, comments turned into threads turned into an online narrative of incompetence and deceit. I saw Claire shrink behind the weight of public opinion, her posts becoming fewer, defensive, and then, finally, silent. Yet in the quiet between storms she became dangerous in a different way, quieter, more deliberate. The woman who had once betrayed me became the woman who was fighting to survive. She stopped being careless. She started checking logs and cross-referencing every interaction. She hired a cybersecurity specialist who traced the anonymous emails to a marketing campaign IP footprint that had once been used by my former employer on a public project. It was a slender lead, but it was real. For the first time since I had begun, fear crept in. Not the fear of being caught for its own sake, but the fear that the person I had hurt would respond in a way that I hadn't expected. Claire wasn't only hurting, she was learning. She dug into financial records with the methodical persistence that used to make me proud of her. In college, she discovered discrepancies that suggested Adam had been siphoning funds into a private account he never disclosed. She found receipts for lavish meals and hotel bookings that were coded under vendor names. When she confronted him, their relationship splintered in a new direction. Adam, cornered, lashed out and revealed secrets he had kept even from her. Deals cut with questionable vendors, a loan taken without her consent, a string of clients who had been overcharged and then appeased with discounts that left them barely solvent. Claire's world, already teetering, collapsed into multiple smaller collapses. In that moment I felt a dissonant rush of validation and horror. Validation because the ruin I intended was happening, and horror because the target I'd aimed for wasn't the only one falling apart. The complication was that Claire's discovery about Adam reframed everything. She started to speak in public about being conned by a business partner rather than about incompetence. Her narrative changed from failed vendor to victim of embezzlement, and suddenly people who had once applauded her creativity began to sympathize. Donations trickled into her account from strangers moved by her blog posts. A former client offered a small contract contingent on accepting stricter oversight. The tide of public opinion, which I had thought to be a weapon against her, started to become a shield. I realized then that revenge, when applied indiscriminately, can have unpredictable hydrodynamics. It can flood and then recede. But it can also carve new channels that bring life to places you wanted to leave barren. Rage and strategy had become tangled in my chest. The more I tried to map the consequences, the less I felt like a hero of justice, and the more I felt like a vandal convinced of righteousness. That ambivalence was interrupted by a revelation that smelled of irony and consequence. The journalist who'd been poking around published a piece that did not name me, did not name Claire, but spoke in pointed detail about how personal betrayals can trigger vendettas that ruin careers. The piece included interviews with experts on workplace sabotage and anonymous anecdotes from people who'd wrecked businesses in the name of retribution. The internet loved it. Comments poured in from both sides of the equation. Some applauded the anonymous avenger, others warned of the immorality of vigilante justice. One commenter, whose account name I did not recognize, left a single line that felt like a scalpel. Revenge reshapes you into the person your pain teaches you to be. The words landed on me like a verdict. For the first time, I wondered whether the woman standing over the rubble was a stranger to the woman who had once cried into my shoulder about a broken first love. Claire took advantage of the public attention by launching a transparency campaign. She posted scanned receipts showing discrepancies with Adam's expenses and set up a live stream where she walked viewers through the evidence. The response was messy and raw. Some of the community rallied to her side, some turned away because of the initial scandal, and some began to dig deeper into Adam's past clients. Legal entanglements followed. Adam sued Claire for defamation. Vendors countersued Adam for unpaid bills. The chaos birthed an ecosystem of investigations, each pulling at threads that sometimes led to places I'd touched. My involvement, meticulous as I thought I'd been, had left traces. The investigators' notes, the anonymous emails, the phone number of the burner I'd used. None of these were incriminating on their own, but together they could form a pattern. Fear, previously theoretical, became a practical concern when the investigator I'd hired messaged me asking to be paid and hinted that he had found something interesting. I paid him more than I should have and told myself that it was a necessary expense to keep the machinery quiet. I felt tightness in my throat that wasn't only stress. It was the physical sensation of guilt tightening its fist. Then the thing I had been avoiding happened. A single envelope arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside was a photograph from college, Claire and me laughing in a rainstorm, faces upturned and youthful, and a scrap of paper with 3 words, "I know you." The message was not a threat but a confirmation. Whoever had sent it wanted me to know that my secret was not as safe as I'd believed. I held the photo until the edges softened beneath my fingertips. The face looking back at me belonged to a girl who still believed in blunt honesty, in the kind of friendship that didn't require a ledger of grievances. The mirror reflected a different face now, one marked by sleep deprivation, strategy, and a repetitive cycle of justification. The envelope did something unexpected. It terrified me not because it exposed me, but because it showed that I could be seen, and what being seen would force me to reconcile. I should have stopped there. I should have walked away and let the rot from the seeds I'd planned to take its course, and then wither. But the discovery of Adam's embezzlement made me reckless in a new way. I told myself that exposing Adam fully would vindicate me. It would prove that my actions had eliminated a parasite, not merely punished Claire. I started compiling the evidence I'd purchased into a dossier, one that could be anonymously mailed to authorities and to the press. The dossier would show a pattern of fraud that could not be ignored, and if it did its work, Adam would be prosecuted and Claire would be absolved enough to climb back up. The plan felt surgical, necessary, righteous. Yet every time I clicked send on another anonymous tip or slipped another document into an envelope, I watched the photograph in my kitchen and felt as if I were erasing a line in a shared diary. The more I tried to justify, the thinner the paper of my excuses became. As Claire rebuilt her public persona around resilience, and as Adam fought back with legal threats that now pointed at her as the cause of their client's loss, a new player emerged, Ethan. He had been a ghost in this saga, a man whose betrayal had started it all and who had floated in its periphery. Unexpectedly, he reached out to Claire in a public comment, apologizing for his part and admitting his faults in a way that seemed contrite and oddly timed. When he did, the public reaction split. Some saw his apology as closure for me and as an embarrassing footnote to the story. Others suspected it as a strategic move to curry favor and distract from his own culpability. Claire's acceptance of his apology and her public framing of the past as painful but instructive felt like a public exorcism of ghosts. That exorcism left me wry. Watching her reclaim narrative while I sat buried under the craft of dismantling her made me realize that the war I thought I was waging on betrayal had become a war on the idea that either of us could ever heal. The envelope, the photo, the investigator's texts, Adam's exposed ledger, Ethan's public apology. They converged into a knot of consequences I could no longer fully untangle. I had set out to punish one betrayal and instead entangled myself in a web where everyone suffered in different ways. The story of retribution I had written in my head as clean and inevitable was becoming messy and morally incoherent. In the middle of the night, I answered an anonymous comment on one of Claire's old posts that simply read, "Why not tell the truth?" I stared at the blinking cursor and then closed the laptop without typing a word. The truth, I realized, would not free me. It would force me to stand in the rubble and take responsibility for what I had wanted revenge to fix. The envelope remained on the table, a quiet accusation and a fragile reminder that the person who knew me best might already know what I had done. When I received the second envelope, I almost didn't open it. The first one had shaken me enough to start sleeping with my phone screen down and the curtains drawn. But curiosity, or maybe self-preservation, made my fingers slide along the seal anyway. Inside, there was no note this time, only a USB drive. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop, half expecting malware or a virus. Instead, a single folder popped up labeled Reckoning. Inside were screenshots, emails, messages, contract drafts, all from the fake identity I had used to infiltrate Claire's business. It was everything. Every fabricated invoice, every strategic mistake, even the metadata pointing back to my real IP address. Whoever had sent this knew exactly what I had done and wanted me to see it. My heart thudded in my ears as I realized that the person holding this evidence had the power to destroy me completely. For the first time in months, I felt genuine fear, not guilt or paranoia, but the cold, hollow kind that makes you aware of your pulse. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every move I'd made, trying to pinpoint who could have discovered it. My mind circled around three names: the investigator, Ethan, and Claire. The investigator had gone quiet after I paid him off. Ethan didn't have the resources or the brains to trace a fake identity, which left Claire. But how could she have found this much? She'd been scrambling just to stay afloat. Unless she had help. The next morning, I checked her social media, something I hadn't done in weeks. To my surprise, she'd posted a picture, her sitting in a cafe, smiling faintly, with a caption that simply read, "The truth has a strange way of showing up when you stop running from it." My stomach dropped. That wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. I wanted to call her, to confront her, but I couldn't risk exposing myself. Instead, I went to work and tried to function like everything was normal. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched. Every email notification made my chest tighten. I was waiting for the explosion, for the story to go public, for my carefully curated life to collapse in the same spectacular way I had engineered Claire's. But days passed, and nothing happened. The silence was worse than exposure. It gave me too much time to think. Maybe this was her revenge, to let me rot in uncertainty, to make me feel what she had felt when her world began unraveling and she didn't know where the next blow would come from. One evening, after a week of no further messages, I drove to Claire's neighborhood. I told myself it was just to reassure myself that she was fine, that she wasn't planning to destroy me. Her car was parked outside, lights on in her apartment. Through the window, I saw her moving around, talking animatedly to someone I couldn't see. For a fleeting moment, she looked happy. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just lighter. I sat there, watching from the safety of shadows, realizing that she might have already won simply by surviving. All my planning, my careful orchestration of revenge, suddenly felt small in comparison to the quiet resilience she'd built from the ruins I'd left behind. I should have driven away, but I didn't. Instead, I got out and walked toward the building. My pulse raced, half from fear, half from something that felt like compulsion. I needed to see her face, to know if she truly knew. I buzzed her intercom before my courage could dissolve. When her voice came through, soft but unmistakably hers, I froze. "Hello," she said, the same way she had years ago when we'd first become roommates. I hesitated too long, and she repeated, "Hello." I panicked and hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my car door. As I slid into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "You didn't have to run. You could have just said you were sorry." My breath caught. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The weight of what I'd done pressed on me in a way it never had before. For months, I had justified my revenge as a balancing act, an eye for an eye. But standing there, realizing she might have found a way to forgive me or at least pity me, made it all feel hollow. The truth was, I hadn't destroyed her. I'd only prolonged both our suffering. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the USB drive, wondering if I should delete it or hand it over to the authorities myself. Confession seemed like the only way to stop the endless cycle of dread. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Days turned into weeks again. Claire started getting her life back together. Small event gigs, sponsorship offers, even interviews about overcoming professional sabotage. She never mentioned names, never pointed fingers. If she knew I was behind it all, she was protecting me by omission. That realization haunted me more than any public exposure could have. I had taken everything from her, and she'd chosen silence. That kind of mercy is sharper than vengeance. I saw her in person again 2 months later, by pure accident. I was at a networking event, and she was there with one of her new clients. When our eyes met across the room, time seemed to stop. She smiled, not warmly, but not coldly either. Just a small, knowing curve of her lips. I couldn't move. The crowd buzzed around us, but in that instant, it was just us and everything unspoken between us. When she walked over, my breath caught. I braced for confrontation, for the moment everything would come crashing down. Instead, she extended her hand. "Natalie," she said softly, "it's been a while." Her tone was perfectly even, her face unreadable. I nodded, too stunned to speak. We stood there for what felt like an eternity before she added, "I heard you've been doing well." It wasn't sarcasm. It was something else, something almost kind. I managed a quiet "yeah, you too." Then she leaned in slightly, just enough for only me to hear, and whispered, "We both learned a lot about trust, didn't we?" Then she pulled away and disappeared into the crowd before I could respond. I didn't remember much after that. The rest of the event blurred. Her words echoed in my head, looping endlessly. We both learned a lot about trust. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was truth. When I got home, I opened the USB drive again and stared at the evidence that could destroy me. And then I deleted every file. I deleted the burner accounts, the emails, the fake profiles. I watched months of scheming vanish into digital nothingness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I cried. Not the angry kind of tears that follow betrayal, but the kind that come when you finally realize how much you've lost in trying to win. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I received one final message from that same unknown number. It said, "I forgave you before I ever found proof. Take care of yourself, Nat." I stared at it for a long time, unable to decide if it was closure or punishment. Maybe both. Either way, I knew then that revenge hadn't saved me. It had consumed me, reshaped me, and left me standing in a version of my life that I barely recognized. I deleted the message and turned off my phone, watching my reflection in the black screen, a stranger who finally understood what it meant to lose everything, including herself. But there was still one thing left to do, one act that might not undo the damage, but might finally set me free. And I knew exactly where to start. When Lily walked into that courtroom a year later, it wasn't for a trial, it was for the reading of a will. A mutual acquaintance of hers and Sophie's father, a man named Edward Miller, had passed away unexpectedly. He'd been a quiet, wealthy investor who once mentored Sophie's father, and through some strange twist of fate, he had left behind an inheritance clause that somehow connected all three of them. Lily almost didn't go, assuming it had nothing to do with her, but curiosity got the better of her. When the lawyer began reading, Sophie sat 2 rows behind her, holding hands with the same ex Lily had once loved. They looked miserable. She could tell by their hollow expressions. And then, as if the universe had scripted it, Lily's name was read out. Edward Miller had left a small real estate company to her, the same company that Sophie and her ex had been running into the ground. Lily felt a slow smile spread across her face as realization dawned. Over the months since her breakup, Sophie and the ex had tried to start a business, one funded by that very company, taking risky loans and mismanaging everything. But the paperwork was still under Miller's trust. And now, by legal right, that trust belonged to Lily. It took her a few weeks to process the irony. She met with Miller's attorney and reviewed the financials. Sophie and her ex had bled the company dry, leaving mountains of debt, and paid taxes, and dozens of angry employees. But the assets, the properties, the rights, the leverage, all belonged to Lily now. The revenge that had once been an abstract dream suddenly had a structure, a purpose. Lily could have simply walked away, but she didn't. She began making calls, reaching out to the creditors, reorganizing the accounts, bringing in new partners. She fired Sophie and her ex legally, reclaiming the contracts they had stolen. The look on Sophie's face that day was something Lily would never forget, disbelief mixed with humiliation. The same expression Lily herself had worn months earlier when she'd found them together. Sophie begged her to reconsider, but Lily had grown far beyond the need for her approval. Every act of betrayal had turned into fuel for this moment. Within a few months, Sophie and her ex were forced to sell their personal assets to cover part of the business debt they had racked up. The luxury apartment they had rented? Gone. The car Sophie had flaunted online? Repossessed. They had nothing left but the hollow comfort of each other's company, which soon after collapsed too. Lily didn't gloat publicly. She didn't post about it, didn't call anyone to boast. But the story spread through mutual circles on its own, whispered between acquaintances. She wasn't the scorned woman anymore. She was the one who had rebuilt herself from ashes and quietly let karma do the rest. A year later, Lily had turned the company round. It became a small but stable real estate firm, providing affordable housing projects. Her team respected her, clients trusted her, and for the first time in years, she slept soundly. One evening, while reviewing a contract, she got an email. It was from Sophie. It read simply, "You won. I hope it was worth it." Lily stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed back, "It wasn't about winning. It was about remembering who I am." And she sent it. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and stepped onto her balcony, looking over the city lights. The pain that once consumed her was gone, replaced by quiet peace. She realized revenge hadn't been about destruction. It had been about reclaiming power. Her story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about survival, rebirth, and the unexpected beauty of starting over, somewhere in that city. Sophie and her ex were probably still trying to crawl out of their financial mess, still blaming everyone but themselves. But Lily didn't care. She had everything she needed: freedom, dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing that no matter how cruel life had been, she had risen above it without becoming like them. The final act of revenge, she realized, wasn't taking everything from them. It was proving she didn't need them to be whole.